Hello, welcome to ONTIC's Connected Intelligence Podcast. I'm Fred Burton, ONTIC's Executive Director of Protective Intelligence. This podcast offers valuable insights and practical advice to help you navigate the complexities of modern corporate security shared by leaders and innovators in the field. Now, on to the discussion. Hi, I'm Fred Burton here today with Stephen R. Ward. Steve is a retired CIA intelligence officer who specialized in Iran and the Middle East. He currently works at the Pentagon for the Joint History and Research Office. While at the CIA, he also served as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East on the National Intelligence Council and as Director of Intelligence Programs on the National Security Council staff. Between 2010 and 2012, he was a CIA visiting professor to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. He is the author of Immortal, A Military History of Iran and Its Armed Forces, and has recently published Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, A Concise History, which I have right here, Steve. Thanks so much for being on the ONTIC Connected Intelligence podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you wrote a wonderful book, and I've pushed it around my entire network. And I think folks would be very intrigued if you can tell us a little bit about your background and your time at the agency.
Okay, well, I joined CIA in the late summer of 1985 after spending 5 years in the military, the U.S. Army. As you mentioned, I worked Iran and Iraq for most of my career with some occasional side trips into South Asian analysis and North African analysis. Also, as you mentioned, I was like a lot of CIA officers. I got to do tours at the National Security Council, the National Intelligence Council. Um, I think of interest to this program's listeners was I also did two tours working in the Director of Operations. While most of my career was as an analyst, I did these tours to provide analytic support to CIA operations. And uh, that was just a really rewarding experience for me to get involved in supporting our spy craft and things that we were doing. And as a matter of fact, in line with kind of our program in the mid 1990s, I was asked to lead a small team of analysts and technical specialists as part of a larger Iran operational operation that we were kind of mimicking what was already happening in the counterterrorism center and the other centers at CIA, where you were putting the case officers next to analysts, next to other specialists to try and drive operations. And nowadays, it's basically called targeting analysis, and there's basically a whole field that does that. But in the mid 1990s, it was still relatively new, and my small team. Of analysts. I had people from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency that was working with us. Uh, I tried to do some support to the operations, and in one case, George Tenet writes about it in his biography. But uh, our guys identified MOIS or Ministry of Intelligence officers from Iran around the world, and we had a disruption operation where basically we sent out case officers to just do cold pitches to all these Iranians. And Tenet writes about how John Brennan, a future CIA director, made a cold pitch to the MOIS officer in Saudi Arabia and how that went. And there was obviously a lot of follow up to it, but it did upset the Iranians quite a bit. Another thing that came out of that particular uh, operation, or not that operation, but my assignment to the director of operations was years later, after 9/11, I was asked to head what they called the Afghan task force, but it was really just this 24/7 watch office where we did situation reports and tried to relieve the analyst of the burden of answering, the constant request for information. But at one point, because I had the background in working with the director of operations and actually knew the chief of the counterterrorism center at the time, Kofor Black, and it worked for him. When someone suggested that we should do a special uh, daily brief for the president that combined intelligence analysis and operational information, uh, the fact that I was available to do that and that Kofor knew me made it a lot easier for everyone to agree that I could do that, because I'm sure it wasn't the first time it ever happened, but there was a lot of resistance on the operational side to be giving operational details to an analyst to write up and present to policymakers.
Yeah,
But
God forbid, right?
Exactly. But it worked right. It turned out it worked pretty well. And again, I think as an early example of connected intelligence, those were both kind of successful efforts to you know basically be more collaborative and use the stuff that we had available to us to provide customers with a better response and better options.
Steve, I can recall my days on the hostage location task force at the counterterrorism center, and we would sit around and just talk about the degree of Iranian control of the hostages that were held in Lebanon. Certainly we were trying to find CIA Station Chief Bill Buckley. We really had no idea the degree of Iranian control, if any, and was one of those issues that just went back and forth forever. And so when you look at Iran and the book that you wrote, again, Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, what makes Iran's Ministry of Intelligence unique compared to other intelligence agencies around the world?
Um, well, that would be a great test question for students taking the comparative intelligence organization course at Georgetown that this book was written to support. Um, I think overall the ministry is or has elements comparable to many other intelligence services around the world. It's a blend of CIA and FBI, or if you're British, MI5 and MI6. But it's really more strongly focused on internal security matters and counterespionage than on foreign intelligence operations. Um, the things that make it unique, I think, are one, the close tie, because of its internal security focus, between the ministry and Iran's judiciary. MOIS officers are actually given the special classification of judicial officer, which gives them pretty wide police powers to investigate and to arrest and ultimately participate in the prosecution of Iranians and others that they detain on suspicion of being regime opponents or being involved in sedition. Some other unique things, as far as I know, the MOIS is the only service that has its own university, and only, maybe not its own university, but that hires only from graduates of its university.
Oh, that's
Uh,
interesting.
yeah, it's the Eamon Bacher University, which is also the University of Intelligence and National Security, but it is a requirement to graduate from it to be hired by MOIS. And then finally, it's the only service that I know of that by law has to be led by a cleric.
Huh, fascinating. And as you look at the MOIS that you've studied for so many years now, do you see evidence of them targeting Western business interests?
Uh, they they do that. That's typically been one of their missions, is to support Iranian efforts to uh, steal information or just gain access to businesses for the purposes of primarily sanctions busting. The Islamic Republic has basically been under sanctions from its very beginning, and so it's always been important to them to try to find workarounds, and they use the intelligence services for that purpose.
Do you see, like, from a cyber perspective, to me, in going through your book, which I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of this, when you look at their degree of cyber, which appears to be everywhere, along with disinformation, they also seem to be heavily engaged in that. Is that an accurate assessment on my part?
Yeah, very accurate. They've long had the mission of operating in the cyber domain, and the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei several years ago had actually set as a goal that Iran would become a major cyber power, and they seem to be devoting the resources and the effort to do it. A lot of it's not in house. They work with basically contractors and groups within Iran who devote their time to cyber activities of all sorts. Mostly in the area of criminality that allows them to break into businesses and governments. Seems to be their main target. They are very proficient at phishing scams and other types of things to where they can approach people digitally and get them to click on a link and give up information or give up access to their computers. I actually had an acquaintance who got phished by the Iranians, and
Mm.
it's a mess. Uh, just to try to back out of that once they get access to your computer and what they can threaten you with and do is really a terrible thing. But um, the Iranians do seem to be keeping pace with other countries like Russia and China and doing these things. They probably don't have quite the same amount of resources, but they are very active in it. And I think we've seen that they have the ability to do damage when they can. Albania, of all places, has suffered from this on a couple of occasions because they host a large contingent of Iranian dissidents that belong to the group, the Mujahideen al that the MOIS perceives as one of its main targets. So the Iranians have shown that they can do these things of disrupting services and the like using the cyber domain.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a moment. But first, I wanted to let you all know that there's an easy way to stay informed about ONTIC's upcoming events and new resources. Subscribe to our monthly newsletter to get updates sent directly to your inbox. Join the 20,000 plus security professionals who are already receiving these insights and sign up today. The link to subscribe is in the episode description. You know, Steve, many years ago when I was a protection agent for the State Department, and we would have the visit of the Iranian foreign minister every year come to the United Nations General Assembly. And I was the one that went in and did a lot of the advanced prep work with the Iranian mission in New York. And I was always um, treated with a high degree of respect, and the Iranians really bent over backwards to help us in the protection of their foreign minister that was visiting every year, and just the sophistication of their diplomats that I was meeting with was right on par of any diplomatic group that I've ever been associated with.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I have not met that many Iranians other than Iranian Americans, but it's a country and a culture that prides itself on being knowledgeable, being professional. Another way of putting it, and respect is greatly important to them. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest obstacles over the decades in U.S. Iranian relations and our efforts to engage with the Iranians is that they, not incorrectly, feel that Americans regularly disrespect them and slight them in ways they don't appreciate. And some of the more hardline members, try to give it back in spades as to how they react to Americans. But they are a community that values expertise, values intelligence. There are other cultural aspects that might affect their ability to do intelligence analysis. I kind of touch on a little bit in the book, but like I said, they are committed to trying to be the best they can be in the areas of statecraft and intelligence work.
Steve, do you, in your course of putting this book together and following Iran for so many years, and you look at the plots that have unfolded and the targeting efforts that the Iranians have now in play that you outline in the book, primarily as a result of the assassination of General Soleimani. And do you envision those plots and attacks to slow down a bit now that the Israelis have, pretty much eliminated the Hezbollah leadership and reached out and touched, individuals inside of Iran? Is this a time period now with the incoming Trump administration where we're going to see that dissipate a bit, or do you envision that ramping up from an analytical perspective?
Think the Iranians are always careful about the timing of some things, but they also, I think, like any intelligence organization, also are driven by opportunity. I think it's worth noting just historically, um, the Iranians. After basically getting beaten very badly in the final year of the Iran-Iraq War in 1988. Within a few years, were very active in Europe with assassinations and kidnappings against regime opponents. Even though you could argue that they were still recovering from the war economically, they needed the Europeans' help, but their desire to settle scores with dissidents was so strong that they continued to do these types of activities that just hurt their relations with Europeans. So I also think it's worth pointing out one of the people assassinated during that period was the last prime minister of Iran, Shapur Bakhtiar, or at least the last prime minister under the Shah. And they had, right after the revolution had come to power, they had put a death sentence on him, but it took them 12 years, and they finally killed him. So they don't give up on certain things. So I think revenge for Soleimani's assassination is likely never going to be put fully aside. But we have seen in the past where when they're drawing too much heat on themselves by their activities, is that they will back off at least for a little while.
Yeah, they're novel kinds of plots. Many years ago, before I became a agent with the State Department, I was also a police officer in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I was at the scene where we had the Iranian dissident that was assassinated by the hitman that was dressed like a post office delivery man and shot and killed him at the front door, and then fled to Iran, where I believe he's still hunkered down there, yeah, and given safe haven. So that was something like that was right out of James Grady's 3 Days of the Condor kind of novel.
Yeah, and they still are looking for those types of things. They will find willing Iranian Americans, and increasingly just going to criminal groups who are uh, willing to do surveillance and to make plots to try and kill or capture enemies of the Iranian state. Most recently here in America was the Masih al-Najad uh, case up in New York City, where you have this Iranian American journalist and activist that the MOIS put together a team of people to surveil her, and their plot was to kidnap her and move her to a third country to eventually get her to back to Iran for trial. But they weren't particularly good, and their tradecraft was terrible, and they were caught fairly early in that plot. But the head of MI5 just last fall said they'd uncovered something like 20 Iranian plots of the same sort of type of using criminals and other elements to surveil and target Iranian dissidents. And that just goes to show that the Iranians never quite give up. Now, again, right now their circumstances seem very bad because of what the Israelis have done to Hamas and Hezbollah, and of course the loss of Syria as a major Arab ally, their only Arab ally, is a big setback for the Iranians. But I don't think that necessarily changes any of the guidance that has been given to the MIS or to the Revolutionary Guard on how they go after opponents of the regime.
Steve, I know your focus was the MOIS. If you had to look at the two organizations, the IRGC and the MOIS, who is the most powerful inside of Iran?
Um, Clearly, overall, the Revolutionary Guard is just in terms of its size, its budget, the fact that it is totally uh, spread throughout the Iranian economy. it's a much larger, more powerful organization. In the intelligence side of it, the IRGC Quds Force, which was commanded by General Soleimani, who we were just talking about, and is now commanded by General Ghani, um, is the action arm of the Iranian state in terms of playing a role, kind of like special forces, but kind of the role of CIA of supporting groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, other dissidents. They do the assassinations and a lot of the uh, revenge attacks on Israel that responded to many times Israel has successfully conducted sabotage and attacked people inside Iran. That usually falls to the Guard. So the MOIS basically lets the Guard have that lane, and they focus on the things that they do best, which is mostly internal security, going after people they say involved in sedition and people who are threatening the regime. Um, I think the two groups actually collaborate pretty well when they're going against larger armed groups, such as the threat that Iran's had to address from the Islamic State or from militant Baluch minority groups and Kurdish groups. But I think the MOIS is recovering a bit in large part because even before the October 23 Israeli-Palestine war started, the Guard had had a lot of failures. Again, going back to the Israelis being able to conduct sabotage and assassinations inside Iran, and it was primarily the Guard's responsibility. And There was a period there when the the late president Raisi, who died last May in a helicopter crash, he his minister for intelligence Ismail Khatib and the current chief justice of Iran, uh, Mohseni Ejei, were all close compatriots who had worked together in the judiciary. And Raisi, in his younger days, had worked with and for the MOIS. Hatib had worked for the MOIS, and
Interesting.
Mohseni Ejei had been a minister running the organization. So I thought that you had a combination there between 2021 and 2023 where you had these three men who are very closely linked together, uh, all linked to the Ministry of Intelligence, that probably increased its profile and its clout within the government at the time. And I suspect that hasn't changed that much. The new president, Pezeshkian, has kept Hatib on as minister, and Mohseni Ejei is still head of the judiciary. And I suspect that actually will work to the ministry's favor because Pezeshkian is a reformer and not a fan of the hardline conservatives who are most closely associated with the Revolutionary Guard. So, in terms of policy and activities inside Iran, that's probably going to help the MOIS.
And your book does a very good job of outlining those liaison services that have supported the MOIS, such as Russia and China. And obviously, Syria now is probably off the table, I would imagine. But if you had to look over the horizon, Steve, where do you see the MOIS in the next 18, 24 months?
Um, I think they'll continue on the path they're on now, which is to focus on internal security of keeping a restive Iranian public quiet, uh, despite all of Iran's defeats with the axis of resistance in Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. Its real vulnerabilities has been and continues to be a very bad economy, lots of problems socially and environmentally, things that make people unhappy, and we know that the regime is just not very popular. So that's got to be its main focus. Uh, that said, though, the cyber domain just gives it an opportunity at relatively low cost to be operating around the world and continuing to do the type of things it does to identify vulnerabilities and then try to exploit them, whether it's in utilities or banks or businesses that they can use to Iran's advantage. I think they are handicapped a little bit by the fact that they do have this parallel intelligence organization run by the Revolutionary Guard, and that there are other interests in the country that kind of get into each other's way and make foreign policy much more difficult for the Iranians to conduct than maybe other countries. But for the ministry, they will continue to try to push ahead into all the fields they've been to secure the country, primarily against internal threats and then sort of secondarily against whatever external threats might be working their way.
Thank you for that look. Steve, we ask every guest, so you're not on the spot here. What does the phrase connected intelligence mean to you?
Uh, well, it's probably similar to everybody else, but in the course of my career, the idea of connectivity and intelligence, generally did refer to how we were making these sustained efforts to integrate technology in a way to allow analysts to collaborate uh, easier and better with one another. Honestly, when I started in the late summer of 1985, we would draft an intelligence analysis, and I would then hand carry it around the building to
Me too.
one or more offices to get people to read it and sign off on it. And when I wanted to talk to my intelligence community counterparts, it was by a phone, or we would go to the one fax machine in the operations center that could send secure messages and would fax material out. So, there's just no comparison to the connectivity that people have today. Uh, I think it just the opportunities to leverage broader, more efficient cooperation is just so great. That said, as an old guy, I would also offer the caveat that over the course of my career, as I was able to reach out and touch more people electronically and digitally, that the collaboration benefits only go so far. That when you've got a lot of people involved and you're sending stuff to group email addresses, that you start to develop your own cloud of chaff that sometimes makes it hard to assimilate ideas and actually find insights or not get so many conflicting views that you can hammer out an actual uh, coordinated position, and that is a problem. And then the last thing I would just say is this may be kind of a truism for most people, but the best technology that I know of so far, can't read minds, can't understand the human heart, and whether you're dealing with targets or customers for people in our business. That's the human element that I don't think ever goes away. That you have to consider. I don't know if we have time, but just briefly, in the current research I'm doing for the Joint History Office, I'm looking at the George W. Bush administration. And I've
Mm.
just been finishing up the period that covers the surge in Iraq, or the development of the surge strategy in Iraq, and I kept coming across these documents where administration officials were kind of complaining and worried that all the information coming out of Baghdad in 2006 was too optimistic and too rosy, and uh, and they were complaining that the military wasn't giving them a clear picture. And having worked on the National Intelligence Council during that time, I had to smile because one of the things we did at the time, it was just standard operating procedures, that in order to get the White House at the time to pay attention to the information you were sending them, was you could not lead off with bad information. You absolutely had to start out with, here are the good things that are happening, then go to, here's all the bad stuff that's happening. And then you had to kind of conclude with, and here are some optimistically hopeful things that could develop to change the situation. And that was just a marching order that we got, because as administration officials, and I don't want to pick on them. I think every administration I ever worked under had kind of a similar review of like, we don't like negative intelligence or intelligence that presents our policy negatively, and you have to be careful in how you present it to get the customer to hear what you're saying and then act on it appropriately.
That's fascinating. Well, I look forward to your next book, but Iran's Ministry of Intelligence is a great read. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's written by Steve Ward. So pick up a copy. And Steve, thank you so much for being on the ONTIC Connected Intelligence podcast.
Well, thank you again for having me.
Thanks for listening in. To find more episodes, visit us at ontic.co/podcasts. Don't forget to rate and subscribe on your streaming platform of choice. Know someone who would be a great podcast guest? Or have questions you'd like us to answer? Email us at podcast@ontic.co. This episode was produced by AJ McKeon. And I'm Fred Burton. Thanks for listening.